They say the dead don't speak, but sometimes they leave echoes loud enough to change a life. On a cold November night, inside a quiet cemetery, one act of kindness would uncover a truth buried for 25 years. And by morning, nothing would ever be the same again. November 25, 2025. 7 o'clock in the evening. Oakwood Cemetery, Memphis, Tennessee. Grace Williams stood at the tall iron gates, the cold keys heavy in her palm as she prepared to lock up for the night. The air had that sharp, metallic bite that came just before winter fully claimed the city, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she glanced back across the grounds one last time. 8 years. That's how long she'd worked here as a groundskeeper. 8 years of tending to the quiet residents she liked to think of as simply sleeping. Before that, she'd spent 20 years as a nurse, her hands trained to save the living instead of caring for the dead. Some people found the change strange. Grace never did. This place wasn't about death to her. It was about memory, about promises that didn't fade just because someone was gone. Her boots followed the familiar gravel path through Section C, past ancient oak trees whose roots cracked the earth like old scars. She stopped in front of a simple granite headstone, worn but clean. Catherine Ann Pierce, 1964-2000. Beloved mother and sister. Grace bent down slowly and placed a fresh white rose against the stone, her fingers lingering there for a moment. She did this every week. Had done it for 25 years without fail. "Good night, Katie," she whispered. "I miss you, sister." The words stayed close to her heart. Few people knew that a black woman and a white woman had grown up as sisters in 1970s Memphis. Some bonds were too sacred to explain. Grace took a few steps to the right, stopping at a marker that barely qualified as one. No name, just a county number etched into stone. John Doe, number 247. "Rest easy, Tommy," she said quietly. Grace knew exactly who lay there. Thomas Michael Pierce, Catherine's husband. A good man once, before grief and alcohol broke him down piece by piece. 3 years earlier, she'd found him sleeping rough inside the cemetery, deliberately letting the cold claim him less than 20 feet from his wife's grave. She'd taken him home, fed him, given him warmth and dignity for 15 months until his heart finally failed in March of 2023. He'd died holding her hand, apologizing to people who weren't there anymore. Grace straightened, the ache in her knees familiar now, when the sound of an engine cut through the quiet. Headlights swept across the stones. Her brow furrowed. The cemetery was closed. She turned toward the entrance just as a black Tesla slipped through the open gates before she could lock them. The car rolled slowly down the path and stopped directly in front of John Doe 247's grave. Grace stayed back near an oak tree, watching. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even in the dim lamplight, she could tell he was young, maybe mid-30s. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, but it hung on him like he hadn't slept in days. He reached back into the car and pulled out a bottle. Bourbon. Expensive. He dropped to his knees in front of Thomas's grave, twisted the cap, and drank straight from it. His shoulders began to shake. "Why?" His voice cracked, raw and broken. "Why did you have to die like this?" He drank again, deeper this time, his body swaying. Grace recognized the signs instantly. 20 years in emergency rooms taught you when someone had gone too far. She stepped forward. "Sir, are you?" He turned toward her voice, eyes glassy and unfocused, and then his body gave out. He fell sideways, his head striking the granite marker with a sickening crack. The bottle shattered. Blood streamed down his face. Grace ran. Her legs protested, but instinct overruled pain. She dropped beside him, fingers finding his neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. His breathing was shallow, the smell of bourbon overpowering. "Sir, can you hear me?" She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady despite the fear clawing up her spine. Oakwood Cemetery, Section C. Male, mid-30s, head trauma, possible alcohol poisoning. She pressed her scarf against the gash on his temple, tilted his head to keep his airway clear. 8 minutes later, an ambulance tore through the gates, red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. 2 EMTs jumped out, bags in hand. "Do you know him?" one asked as they worked. Grace spotted a wallet near the broken glass and picked it up carefully. Tennessee license. Jonathan Pierce. 35. The name meant nothing to her. Pierce was common. She'd known dozens. I found him like this, she said. He collapsed. You saved his life, the EMT told her as they loaded Jonathan onto the stretcher. Another hour out here and he wouldn't have made it. Grace watched the ambulance disappear, the wallet heavy in her hand. She set it gently on Thomas's headstone so it wouldn't be lost and stared down at the grave. Why were you visiting him, Tommy? She whispered. Tire tracks scarred the damp earth. Old ones. He'd been here before. More than once. She locked the gates and drove home to her small Cooper Young house, exhaustion settling into her bones. That night, she pulled an old photo album from the bottom drawer of her dresser. The first picture showed a white woman with kind eyes holding a black baby. Eleanor Pierce and baby Grace, 1967. Next, two teenage girls laughing with arms around each other. Catherine and Grace, 1979. Then Catherine, pregnant and glowing. Then a newborn baby in Grace's arms. Baby Jonathan, a little boy holding her hand. Jonathan and Aunt Gracie, 1995. The last photo showed a 10-year-old boy with a gap-toothed grin. You'd be 35 now, Grace whispered. Catherine had died when Jonathan was 10. His grandmother had taken him to Nashville. Grace had searched for him for years. Letters returned. Calls unanswered. A private investigator eventually found traces of him. MIT, a tech company, success. Alive. She'd told herself that had to be enough. She closed the album, unaware that the man she'd saved hours earlier was the boy she'd been searching for all along. 1 week later, Jonathan Pierce sat in his Tesla outside the cemetery gates, engine running. His head still throbbed faintly from the stitches. The doctor's lecture about alcohol poisoning echoed in his ears. He should go in. He should thank the woman who saved him. The hospital had given him her name. Grace Williams. But gratitude came with questions, and questions came with truths he wasn't ready to face. He turned off the engine anyway and stepped out, carrying 2 bouquets of white roses. He walked to Section C and knelt before his mother's grave. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have come back sooner. He placed the roses, then turned to the unmarked grave beside hers. I should have looked for you, Dad. Mr. Pierce. Jonathan froze. A woman stood nearby, pruning shears in hand. She was kind-faced, late 50s, with silver threading her hair. You're the man from last week, she said gently. I'm glad you're all right. Thank you, he replied quickly. I'm John. Grace smiled. Nice to meet you, John. And as he walked away, the lie burned heavier than the guilt he'd carried for 25 years. Jonathan told himself he wouldn't come back, yet 3 days later he found himself walking the same gravel path with 2 cups of coffee warming. His hands. Grace was trimming hedges near Catherine's grave when she noticed him. Morning, Grace, he said, holding out a cup. She looked surprised, then pleased. That's very kind of you, John. They sat on a bench beneath the oak trees, steam rising between them. Jonathan didn't know they were sitting 20 feet from his mother. You come here often? Grace asked. Yes, he said, to see people who mattered to me. Grace nodded, not pushing. Family, he swallowed. I think so. It's complicated. Most families are, she said softly. Something about her tone loosened something inside him. He found himself talking more than he'd meant to. Not details, just feelings. Regret, estrangement, loss. Grace listened without judgment, the way good nurses did. Why are you so kind to strangers? He asked suddenly. Because everyone deserves kindness, she replied. Especially people carrying pain. He started coming back 2 or 3 times a week after that. Coffee, pastries, small talk about weather and birds and the history of the cemetery. Grace laughed at his dry jokes. He relaxed in a way he hadn't in years. Neither of them knew the truth yet, but Grace was beginning to feel something stir in her chest. Patterns. White roses. The way he traced Catherine's name with reverent fingers. His watch. His car. A phone call she overheard once. Mr. Pierce, the board meeting. his hesitation when she asked his age. 35. Catherine's son would be 35. One evening, Grace sat at her kitchen table, tea going cold as the pieces slid together. "Oh, Katie," she whispered. "Is it you?" She pulled the cemetery files the next morning. Catherine Ann Pierce. Son, Jonathan Michael Pierce. She pulled Thomas's file. Estranged from son. Grace drove home shaking. At home, she held the old photo up to the light and compared it to the man she'd been sharing coffee with. The eyes. The tilt of the head. "It's you," she said aloud. She decided not to rush him. Love couldn't be forced. She began leaving gentle hints, telling stories about losing someone like a son, about chosen family, about promises made long ago. Jonathan listened but didn't hear it yet, too buried in his own guilt. In early January, he asked her to dinner. Grace invited him into her home, fed him fried chicken and collard greens, watched him eat like someone who'd forgotten what care tasted like. He noticed the photos on her walls. Eleanor Pierce. Catherine. Grace told him about a white woman who chose love over fear in 1967. He told her about a mother who loved white roses. They circled the truth without touching it. That night, Grace wrote a letter she didn't know when she'd give him, pouring 25 years of love and loss onto paper. She folded it and placed it in the box with the photos, whispering a prayer for timing. February came cold and bright. On the 15th, Grace woke with a headache she tried to ignore. She planted tulip bulbs anyway. Jonathan arrived with coffee, noticed her pallor. "Grace, are you okay?" "Just tired," she said. He hesitated, hands shaking. "I need to tell you something." She turned toward him, heart pounding. "My name isn't." The world tilted. Grace clutched her chest, her words slurring, her left side going slack. Jonathan caught her as she fell, screaming for help, holding her as if he'd lose her if he let go. "Don't leave me," he begged. Her right hand found his face, weak but sure. "My boy," she whispered. The ambulance came fast. "Are you family?" an EMT asked. "Yes," Jonathan said without hesitation. "I'm her nephew." And for the first time in decades, the word felt true. The surgery lasted 5 hours. Jonathan sat in the waiting room, memories colliding, fear clawing his chest. When the doctor finally emerged and said she'd live, Jonathan cried openly. That night, he went to her house to find her papers and found the box instead. Photos. His childhood. Her letter. The truth he'd been running from. He read until dawn, sobbing, understanding at last that he'd never been abandoned. Back in the ICU, he held her hand and told her everything. "I'm not hiding anymore," he whispered. "I'm home." And when her fingers squeezed his, he knew she heard him. Maya drove home that evening with the envelope resting on the passenger seat like something unreal, an artifact from another life that didn't quite belong to her yet. The rain had started again, light but steady, but for the first time in weeks it didn't feel oppressive. It was just rain. She kept glancing at the envelope at stoplights, half expecting it to vanish, convinced this had to be some elaborate misunderstanding. When she reached her apartment, she set the envelope carefully on the small kitchen table and made tea she barely tasted. Her hands shook as she opened her laptop and logged into her student loan account. $48,217. The number that had hovered over every decision she'd made for 7 years. In 3 to 5 business days, it would be gone. She closed the laptop before the weight of it all could crush her again and called her mother. Her voice broke as soon as she tried to explain. Her parents cried with her, disbelief turning into gratitude, fear melting into relief. When she hung up, Maya sat in silence, listening to the rain, feeling lighter than she had in years, as if something fundamental had shifted inside her. Over the next few days, she moved through her shifts in a strange haze. Everything felt sharper. The sounds of the monitors, the voices in the hallways, the small moments of humanity that usually blurred together. On the 4th day, she checked her bank account and saw the funds had cleared. $75,000. Real. Available. She sat on the edge of her bed staring at her phone, heart pounding. Then she logged into her loan account and made the payment. 1 click. Payment received. Balance. 0. She closed her eyes and let the relief wash through her, deep and overwhelming. She transferred money into savings. $10,000. An emergency fund. Something she had never had before. She scheduled a dentist appointment. Bought groceries without calculating every item. That evening, she went to a real restaurant and ordered wine, ordered salmon, ate slowly, savoring the unfamiliar feeling of safety. A week later, she stood on Samuel Hartman's front porch in a quiet neighborhood near the edge of town. His house was modest, a single-story blue ranch with a neat lawn and flower beds that hinted at careful attention. He opened the door himself, looking stronger than she remembered, his faded cardigan now looking like a choice instead of a necessity. "Maya," he said warmly. "I'm so glad you came." Inside, the house was filled with books and photographs. Evelyn was everywhere. Wedding photos, travel pictures, candid moments frozen in time. They sat with tea, and Maya tried to find words big enough. "You changed my life," she finally said. Samuel smiled gently. "You changed mine first." He told her about Margaret O'Connor, the nurse who had saved him as a boy. How that one act of kindness had echoed through decades. Then he leaned forward. "I want to do something more," he said. "I want to help people who fall through the cracks. Patients like me." He described the idea for a charitable fund, practical and fast, designed to bridge gaps when insurance failed. "I want you involved," he said. "Not as charity, as expertise." Maya hesitated, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to run a fund." "You know the patients," Samuel replied. "That's what matters." She thought about the faces she'd seen over the years. People choosing between food and medicine. She nodded. "Yes, I'll help." They spent hours discussing logistics. An initial endowment. Clear criteria. Minimal bureaucracy. When she left, the sun was setting, and for the first time in years, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. 3 months later, spring had arrived. The rain eased, replaced by soft light and blooming gardens. The Evelyn Hartman Care Fund had helped 27 patients in its first 3 months. Medications covered, equipment provided, readmissions avoided. Maya stood in a conference room presenting the results to hospital staff. The numbers spoke for themselves. Outcomes improved, morale lifted. Samuel listened quietly, pride evident in his eyes. "This is working," he said simply. After the meeting, he pulled Maya aside. "I've been getting letters," he said, showing her envelopes from patients and families. "Gratitude, photos, stories. None of this exists without you," he told her. Maya shook her head. "I just paid for medication." Samuel smiled. That was enough. 2 weeks later, Maya took a real vacation for the first time in 6 years. A small cabin on the coast, 90 miles north. She slept deeply, walked barefoot along the beach, let the ocean air fill her lungs. On the 3rd day, she thought about how close she had come to leaving nursing. How that exhausted version of herself felt distant now. Not gone, but no longer drowning. On the 5th day, Karen texted her. They had used the fund to help a young mother whose baby needed special formula. Maya sat on the porch watching the sun dip into the Pacific, tears in her eyes. Kindness wasn't small. It rippled. It changed trajectories. When she returned home, a package waited at her door. Inside was a framed photograph of Samuel and Evelyn on their wedding day. A note read simply, "Evelyn would have loved you." Maya placed the photo on her shelf and went to bed early, ready for tomorrow. Maya returned to work changed, not in any way that was immediately visible, but in the quiet confidence with which she moved through her days. The work was still hard. Patients were still sick. The system was still broken in ways that no single fund could ever fully repair. But now, when someone fell into that familiar gap between need and affordability, there was something she could do besides document the failure and move on. The Evelyn Hartman Care Fund became part of the hospital's quiet rhythm. Nurses and social workers learned how to submit requests. Decisions were made quickly. Help arrived before situations turned into emergencies. Patients cried when they realized they wouldn't have to choose between medication and rent. Some hugged Maya in the hallway, others simply squeezed her hand, overwhelmed and grateful. Samuel visited often, always bringing cookies from a local bakery, always stopping to talk with the staff. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered names. He asked questions that showed he genuinely cared. Over time, something unexpected happened. The nurses began to stand a little straighter. The quiet despair that had once hung over the break room lifted, just slightly, but noticeably. It wasn't that the work had become easy. It hadn't, but it felt less hopeless. One afternoon, Samuel asked Maya to meet him after work. They sat in the hospital courtyard as late sunlight filtered through the trees. "I've been thinking about the caregivers," he said. "About you. About all of you." He explained his idea for a wellness fund to support healthcare workers directly. Therapy sessions, childcare help, small grants for rest, for recovery, for survival. Maya felt tears build before she could stop them. "People can't pour from an empty cup," Samuel said gently. "If we want patients to heal, we have to take care of the people healing them." The Wellness Fund launched quietly, without fanfare. 37 nurses and staff members received support in its first year. Some used it for therapy they'd been putting off for years. Others took a real vacation for the first time in a decade. One nurse used it to pay for childcare during night shifts so she could keep working without falling apart. The ripple spread further than Maya had imagined. A year after the fund began, Maya stood in the same hospital conference room where she had once felt small and overwhelmed. She now held a new title, Patient Advocacy Coordinator. Half her time was spent in direct care, half working on systemic improvements. Her salary had increased. Her savings account was healthy. She lived in an apartment with heat that worked and windows that didn't leak. Samuel's health remained stable. The medication continued to work. He attended the fund's one-year gathering, standing at the podium with steady hands and clear eyes. "1 year ago," he said, "I was lying in a hospital bed feeling hopeless. A nurse I barely knew chose to help me when she didn't have to and couldn't afford to. That choice created all of this." He gestured to the room. Never underestimate the power of kindness. One act can echo for years. After the event, Maya walked him to his car beneath a clear evening sky. "The fund will outlive me," Samuel said quietly. "That's already arranged. This will keep helping people long after I'm gone." Maya watched his taillights disappear and felt the weight of it settle gently on her chest. Not fear, but responsibility, and pride. Weeks later, she stood at the ocean again, waves washing over her feet, remembering the version of herself who had once felt like she was drowning. She made herself a promise she intended to keep. She would never forget what it felt like to be trapped by impossible choices. She would use what she had been given to make sure others didn't have to face them alone. One person, one moment, one act of kindness at a time. A year later, the Evelyn Hartman Care Fund had helped 118 patients. The Wellness Fund had supported 37 healthcare workers. Rosa Martinez, the first patient helped, volunteered at the hospital, offering comfort to others still waiting. The model spread to other hospitals. Researchers took notice. And through it all, Maya continued her work, tired sometimes, challenged often, but no longer drowning. One night, rain tapped softly against her window as she finished dinner and set a framed photograph of Samuel and Evelyn back in its place. She turned off the light and went to bed early. Tomorrow would come soon enough. And this time, she was ready.